In Africa, we see a similar dynamic at play. The Ishikovetz Family Foundation, which surveys African youth across, I think it's about 15 different countries, in their 2024 survey, they found that 82% of young Africans consider China's influence on the continent as positive, while only 79% regard Washington's standing in a similar vein.
So on the Saudi-Iran deal, very interestingly, we found in Iran, actually, China's image in Iran has not been improving as China's taken on this role of mediator in Middle East conflicts.
For me, one of the areas in African and Global South reporting where I've seen just an organic kind of really big success for China is in representing modernity and futurity. For example, like the large drone displays that happened over New Year in Chinese cities, they drew huge attention. Parts of Africa, parts of the African press I've seen, and similarly kind of self-driving cars.
What's interesting there is that we found in North America and Europe, China's image was in decline well before COVID comes along. And then 2020 hits and China's image continues to decline on very much the same trajectory. So once you sort of shake out all the various differences in the ways that opinion polls are conducted in these places, you find that sort of COVID at most appears to have kind of extended a trend of declining favorability or net approval towards China in the global north. In the global south, well, there is no one story about COVID's impact in the global south.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by our subscribers and Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join a global community of readers for daily news and exclusive analysis about Chinese engagement in Asia, Africa, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Cape Town, South Africa. A very happy new year. Happy 2025, Cobus, and to everybody in South Africa today.
Thank you. Happy 2025 to everyone.
Well, it's another start of a new year for us, and we have been doing this show now for 15 years. So 2025 is going to mark our 15th anniversary of this show. That is kind of funny for us because we thought back in 2010 when we started the show, Cobus and I said to each other, how much can you really talk about? I mean, if we get 3 to 4 months out of this thing, we'll be happy. And here we are, 15 years later, Cobus, and we're still going. So it's really, really quite an accomplishment. And again, we want to thank all of our listeners and supporters over the years for following us on this show and for making it the success that it is. So again, that's really thanks to everybody for their support over the years. Well, today we're going to talk about Chinese public opinion around the world. And there is this perception out there that it breaks down in very clean, neat lines to where China is deeply unpopular in the global north and very popular in the global south. And there is some reason to think that those narratives are accurate, and in part because some of the data tells us that. And a lot of that data is fed by the perceptions that are being created this week. So Chinese Foreign Minister Wang, as he has done for many years in his role as foreign minister, and as the Chinese foreign minister has done for 35 consecutive years, has begun the new year with the first overseas trip in Africa. This week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi will visit Namibia, Republic of the Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. He kicked off the visit in Namibia. He made a quick stop, by the way, in Colombo, Sri Lanka. That's also very interesting. But Cobus, talk to us a little bit about the significance of these visits that the Chinese foreign minister always makes in the first or second week of January, coming to Africa, mixing up the countries that they go to. Sometimes it's West Africa, sometimes it's East Africa, sometimes it's smaller countries, sometimes it's larger countries. But talk to us a little bit about this tradition and why it's important in terms of Chinese foreign policy in Africa.
I think partly the importance is a mix of being transparent and being non-transparent, in the sense of the transparent side being constant and predictable. There's always a foreign minister trip to Africa. It's always like that. And they show up, as they do with FOCAC every 3 years as well. They put a lot of work into the optics of constancy, I think. At the same time, the lack of transparency is this mystery about like where they're going to go and why. Because frequently they take strategically and economically important countries like Nigeria, for example, and then they mix them up with countries that are more out of left field, where one doesn't necessarily see a direct interest for China or, especially, also compared to some of the other countries in sub-regions. So they mix up the countries geographically, they mix them up by size, they try and kind of go to different ones every year. So it's always very interesting and always quite mystifying, actually. It's like what informed these particular choices.
Yeah, and there's no insight that anybody on the outside has in terms of how they choose these countries. One of the patterns that we've seen, though, over the past several years, though, is a focus on Indian Ocean countries. Now, this year, there is no Indian Ocean country, but up until this year, there were quite a few Indian Ocean-facing countries. But for the past 2 years, though, West African countries, particularly in the Sahel, have been the focus. So Chad this year, but last year was Côte d'Ivoire and also Togo. So those West African countries and Francophone countries have been quite popular. So we had a full breakdown on our site, which I invite everybody to check out, about what Wang Yi is doing this week, what are some of the key issues that he is going to be addressing in the various countries. And it's just basically a rundown of the week. And then we're going to finish the week on our Africa show with our Africa editor, Jeronima, who is going to do a review. And we've booked Ovigwe Egu from Development Reimagined to join us at the end of the week as well to give us a full assessment of what Wang did during his 4-nation Africa tour this week. But again, this also, to Cobus's point, this constancy is something that is very important in terms of public perception of the Chinese because of the regular presence that senior leaders have. We just had the visit by U.S. President Joe Biden to Angola. Now, at the same time, that's important, but we don't know when the next U.S. president is going to come. Highly unlikely that President-elect Donald Trump is going to visit Africa during his tenure. He did not do that the last time. His Secretary of State may go, but again, we just don't know. We don't know when the next U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit is going to be. And so all of this kind of builds into this narrative that I mentioned at the top of the program, that China's popularity is growing and building in the global south and at the same time suffering in the global north. As I mentioned, there is some data that I'd like to bring you to set the table for our conversation today that supports that breakdown. So a new survey just came out in December here in Southeast Asia from Malaysia, and this came from the Mercator Center for Opinion Research, which is an independent Malaysian public opinion research agency. And they said that Chinese favorability ratings surged from 2022 to 2024, 77% favorability in 2024, up from 39% in 2022. Now, that's a little bit misleading because that 39% may have been impacted by negative perceptions about China due to COVID around 2022, but nonetheless, that is a very big jump. In Africa, we see a similar dynamic at play. The Ishakovitz Family Foundation, which surveys African youth across, I think it's about 15 different countries, they found last year in their 2024 survey that 82% of young Africans consider China's influence on the continent as positive, while only 79% regard Washington's standing in a similar vein. And that 82% has grown from 79% in 2020, so it's gotten more popular. The U.S. has fallen from 87% favorability in 2020 to 79%. The UK has fallen. The European Union has fallen. Interestingly, Russia's public perception in Africa from 2020 to 2024 has stayed the same. Again, back here in Southeast Asia as well, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, their State of Southeast Asia poll that came out in 2024 showed another dramatic increase of Chinese favorability in Southeast Asia from 38.9% in 2023 to 50.5% in 2024, and for the first time in a long time, eclipsing that of the United States. So Africa and Southeast Asia, China more popular than the United States. Now, let's head up to the global north, and there was a Pew survey, and Pew is the very popular American research agency, and they found that 35% of people across 35 different countries have a favorable view of China. That's a pretty low number. compared with a median of 52% who have a negative view. In the 18 high-income countries that Pew polled, views of China are on balance negative, according to Pew. And then in the 17 middle-income countries that Pew polled, views of China are what they call much rosier. Let me just give you some of those numbers very quickly. In Canada, 71% unfavorable view of China. In the US, 81% unfavorable. 82% unfavorable in Sweden. In Japan, 87% unfavorable. Australia, 85% unfavorable. Cobus, when we talk about this bifurcation of the views between the North and the South, I oftentimes think of what you talk about in terms of discourse power, that a lot of the discourse power of the West, particularly coming out of the United States related to China, makes its way into the global South. And so there is a lot of perceptions of China that are negative, even though the public opinion surveys, as we found, are positive. But it feels like a lot of this discourse power does impact how people in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and other places do view China. But I'd be curious to hear what your take on that in terms of narrative shaping that comes out of these negative views of China in places like the global South.
Well, this is an interesting moment to see all of this in action because, I would argue, and I'm sure other media studies people and so on would have different takes, but that a lot of the negative perceptions in the developed world also reflects a certain level of media monoculture in the developed world as well. I think, one sees this clearly, I think, in the Anglophone world where there's, as we've, over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen increasing consolidation of media companies thanks to deregulation. So, even though there is on the surface a really kind of chaotic, like ecosystem of very many media outlets, frequently when one looks at ownership, there's narrower and narrower ownership. So to a certain extent, I think the kind of almost default negative perception of China in the global North partly, I think, reflects just the ongoing dominance of legacy and other forms of kind of corporate media, I think, in those discourses. And even though they play a strong role in the global South too, the mix is just different, I think, in the global South. But partly also because of different kinds of media being involved, but also people's just lived perceptions are different. What I wonder about is whether the changes in perceptions of China in the global South is reflecting also a kind of a certain limit in the ability of global North media to set the kind of parameters of what we see as reality in the global South. So it's a kind of wordy way of asking, like, is global North media, kind of influence in the global South being mixed and kind of balanced out in some kind of way, or are we seeing other factors at play? So all of this is very interesting for me.
Yeah, those questions are perfect segue for a discussion today about the global public opinion on China. And the folks at the Asia Society Policy Institute last December released a beautiful new data set on looking at global public opinion on China and then separating these questions about global North and global South. In fact, one of the research pieces that they put out in the analysis accompanying the data set is there really a North-South split on China? The Global Public Opinion Project on China is led by Andrew Chubb, who is a fellow on foreign policy and national security at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and he is also a senior lecturer at Lancaster University in the UK. And we are thrilled to have Andrew on the program for the first time. A very good morning to you, Andrew, and Happy New Year.
Good morning, Eric. Great to be with you. I'm a long-time listener for the show, so hearty congratulations on 15 years and nearly 1,000 episodes. Great work that you guys have been doing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your support over the years. You have about 400 shows. You mentioned that you have to catch up in the back catalog, so we'll give you some time to do that. But in the meantime, we're very excited to have a great discussion about the fantastic work that you and the team at the Asia Society Policy Institute did on this question of global public opinion. You heard me break down some of the statistics that come out of the regional polls and then the global poll from Pew, which does set up this narrative that China is deeply unpopular in G7 countries and in the global north, and much more popular in the global south. You suggest that it is more complicated than that in your analysis. Maybe what we can do is start our discussion with an overview of what you and the team found in the Global Public Opinion on China project, and then help us understand this split between North and South.
Yeah, sure thing. So the first thing to say is the project found more than 2,500 opinion polls and put them into a single database since 2000 through to 2024. And obviously, the sort of higher level you go in terms of aggregating the world, the global public opinion on China being sort of the highest level of aggregation, the more problematic it becomes to talk about as a single thing. But we did find evidence that overall, people are forming views of China over time. That comes both from the fact that China's that much more present in all sorts of places around the world by virtue of its companies going out, its government's sort of diplomatic efforts that you mentioned at the top of the show, and all sorts of other sort of people-to-people engagements, etc. So China is basically becoming an increasingly prominent factor in people's lives, as well as the geopolitical competition I should have mentioned, which is especially salient in the global north. But that's actually been accompanied by a pretty robust increase in the number of nationally or at least urban representative opinion polls that have been done around the world over that time period. So that's what sort of enabled us to put these together, I think, for the first time into a single database and to try to grapple with some of those problems of aggregating different opinion polls into a single statistic or a single line on the map. As for the question of divides between the global north and the global south, you're quite right, as you mentioned, in sort of introducing or setting up this question. There is a prevalent narrative that China is simply very popular in the global south and very unpopular in the global north. And the first thing to say about that is it's certainly true that at this stage, China has become very unpopular in most parts of the global north. But the caveat to that is that that's a sort of overall impression of China. We're only aggregating here the most basic questions about how do you feel about China? What's your opinion of China? Is it positive or negative? What's your opinion of China's influence in the world? What's your opinion of China's influence in your country? Those kinds of questions at the most general level. So another kind of avenue to explore and to bring some further nuance into this is how do people's views of China's economy, Chinese technology, China's human rights situation, China's political situation, China's military, etc., how do those correlate with people's overall favorability or overall impressions of China? And we might find that there are different parts of the global north that actually feel more positively about, for example, China's economic development, while there are other parts of the global north that might see that as a net negative. I'm thinking here of my home country of Australia, which has traditionally viewed China's economic development as a pretty good thing, at the same time as being quite skeptical of the geopolitical implications of China's military rise. So that's one caveat with regard to the global north. Now, the other question is China simply popular in the global south? And in general, that is true. It's certainly the case that China is more popular across the global south in aggregate than it is in the global north. No problem with that narrative. However, the big problem sort of comes in when you consider the exceptions to that general rule. So on the continent of Africa, which altogether totals, I think, about 1.4 billion people, positive views of China outweigh negative ones by a ratio of about 3-1. But then in India, which also is very much part of the global south and also has a population of 1.4 billion, there's been a steady decline in China's image to the point where the country on average is, China's net favorability in India is well below zero for the last few years. There are other very interesting exceptions in different parts of the global south as well. Countries like Iran, Brazil, which you guys have been talking about recently, and, Myanmar, various parts of Southeast Asia, also fairly major countries in terms of population and economy, but which have more China skeptic views. So it's probably too simple to say that China is sort of universally popular across the global south.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the methodology that you use to bring all these different studies together. For example, how did you think about physical proximity to China versus not, for example, in kind of comparing different parts of the global south and other parts of if you could also talk about some of the other kind of complications that you have to deal with in bringing all this data together?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Cobus. That's a great suggestion, actually, to run some analyses based on proximity. It's not something that we've looked into as of yet. Like everybody else, we're still kind of getting to know these data and really exploring at the granular level. But there are a few sort of salient problems that you encounter when trying to put different opinion poll results together. The first would be the differences in measurement scales. So sometimes surveys will ask a question and ask for a response on the level of, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And others will kind of ask you to indicate your affection for China on a scale of 0 to 100, with something above 50 indicating that you feel warmly towards China, and below 50 you feel kind of cold and negative towards China. And so the first thing that we did is really flatten out those differences by simply looking at opinion polls which have a very clear division between people who feel overall positive and feel overall negative or feel overall neutral towards China. So that's the first step, is to really focus in on opinion poll results that have a clear division between positive and negative. And then the second step was to apply a moderation formula. So basically to calculate what the tendency or the bias of individual survey sources tends to be. There are different methodologies, online methodologies, phone, in person. Obviously the gold standard is to survey people in person. They introduce different types of biases in terms of the urban populations, more connected populations, more internationalized populations, etc. And so the next step was then to sort of calculate the tendency of each source to give higher or lower net approval ratings for China, and then to adjust the overall results based on any identified biases that we could find in the sources. And so that's what enabled us to put it all together. Now, that only gets us to the point where we have all these results in a single database, but then you've got the problem of, what are your data points? And of course, we have many more data points, especially the further you go back in time. We have many more data points from countries that have, more advanced or more established survey infrastructure, mostly global north countries. But that's being sort of rolled out increasingly in the global south, particularly since the institution of Afrobarometer, but also in other parts of the global south. We've got a Central Asian barometer now, an Arab barometer, Latino barometro, etc. And so then the question is, how do you weight the different results that you've put in your database? The obvious choice would be to simply sort of weight them all equally, but that gives a greater say to the countries that get surveyed more often. So it's not a great way of getting a sort of really global picture that gives equal weight to particularly the global south. Second option would be to look at, just basically weight each country equally each year. And that way you'd average out the countries that get surveyed multiple times in a given year. You just give them the average score, so you don't double count those countries. And in that case, you sort of arrive at a very similar conclusion. What we actually ended up doing, which we think is by far the most defensible way of aggregating all these different opinion poll results, is to actually weight it by population. Because at the end of the day, an opinion poll is a sort of representation of a distribution of views among a population. And so what we've actually done is weight the individual results, the country level results each year according to the population of that country. And that basically makes India a whole lot more important, as I mentioned before, in determining the overall picture of global public opinion on China. But it's very important not to sort of counter that tendency to just look harder at the countries that have more opinion poll results coming out. And so that's what we arrived at in the end, is a global country population weighted average. And by that measure, the negativity the global sort of negativity on China has actually been increasing over time. But interestingly, positive views of China have stayed relatively stable. So over time, China's overall image around the world in aggregate has been in a sort of steady but not dramatic decline over time. And we can talk about what the possible reasons for that might be. But interestingly, it's driven by increasing negativity rather than decreasing positivity.
But it seems that if you're weighing it by population, then India could have then a distortive effect, because here in Southeast Asia, people have a much more complex relationship with China than, say, in the Middle East. And I remember there was an interview with the team at Princeton University who's behind Arab Barometer when they were reflecting on the perceptions between China and the US and the Middle East. And so China came out ahead of the United States. And then in their follow-up questions, they said, why? And people said, I don't know. It's just not the United States. So people's knowledge of China in the Middle East was particularly shallow. And it was just more about an opposition or a protest against what they perceive or the reality of a more intrusive U.S. foreign policy that has been there for decades. In Asia, particularly here in Southeast Asia, lots more familiarity here in Vietnam, in India, border disputes, strong negative media narratives frame this. Also, the presence of large ethnic Chinese populations complicate views about China, where views about local ethnic Chinese, which are very sensitive in Malaysia, Indonesia, and here in Vietnam, are also at the same time complicating people's views of China. And conversely, too, the Malaysia data that came out, the ethnic Chinese population in Malaysia, very popular views towards China right now. So those ethnic populations can sway opinions as well. So it feels a little bit like if the country size, and particularly here in Asia, we have large populations, could distort the global view just because they are so large. How do you overcome those distortions, as particularly coming from India, where Indian media is especially negative towards China?
You make a great point, Eric. And honestly, there aren't any ways of overcoming the particular distortions of particular methodologies of aggregating different opinion polls. I think the best way to counteract or mitigate the distortions of any particular method is to look at different methods. So look at the picture from multiple different angles. Look at the picture with countries weighted equally. Look at the picture on the regional level. And that's something I just want to sort of flag for anybody who might be interested in exploring these data on the website, Global Public Opinion on China, that you mentioned at the Asia Society. The regional view is actually very, very interesting when you can look at the trends in different regions around the world, because there you actually get a high number of data points, but there you also, in some measure, take account of what Cobus flagged earlier in terms of the proximity to China and the different kinds of levels of consciousness or experience that people in different places might have of China. So I don't think there's really a neat solution to any of these problems. That's why we have the multiple measures. But if you're serious about kind of digging into the global picture, then definitely start by looking at it from multiple different angles.
So if we can move to specific regions, you touched on India a little bit, and Eric has also mentioned the ongoing kind of negative coverage of China in the Indian press. So I was wondering, India seems like a particular challenge to deal with, and in the writing, you draw some distinctions between top-down opinion forming and kind of more like bottom-up nationalism, and as different kind of factors in this relatively strongly negative kind of view of China in India. So I wonder if you could unpack India for us a little bit in terms of the survey and what the role is, as you say, between this ongoing kind of drumbeat of very negative coverage in the Indian press, which, just as people who follow the Indian press, we've picked up on a lot. And then at the same time, also the role of popular nationalism in this kind of like cross-border relationship.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and really the most important case as far as the global south is concerned to really get right in terms of understanding India's views of China or Indian views of China. I think one thing to say is that I'm not sure it's entirely true that the totality of the Indian media is, inclined to sensationalize China issues. There's certainly large sections of the Indian media, particularly the sort of the anti-Modi crowd, if you like. And I say this with, the caveat that I'm not an expert on India by any means. But from my observations, there's sections of the Indian media which are quick to seize on provocations from the Chinese side because it makes Modi look bad. There's also large sections of the Indian media, as I understand it, which are also, more aligned with Modi's government, Modi's administration, and the general movement behind that, which might be more inclined to, give Modi a bit of a free pass when it comes to China. I think you guys have covered this in some of your previous podcasts on the India-China border dispute as well. So there's an interesting dynamic between different parts of the Indian media. The way that I interpret the Indian results is very much of the bottom-up type of interpretation, because fundamentally, what we see in many countries is that public opinion does respond to political leadership. Political leadership can set the tone for a relationship with China and how people generally see how their country will relate to China. And from the very top, from the top down, although Modi has sort of positioned himself as a sort of strongman defending India's honor and a kind of nationalist leader, his record in terms of diplomacy with China and in terms of pushing back against China's advancements or encroachments along the line of actual control in the disputed border is not particularly strong. He actually has a long record of cozying up to Xi Jinping personally. And so as a result, I tend to view the negative results in that we've seen in India as being despite this sort of top-down shaping of Indian public opinion that might come from the Modi administration, rather than because of it. And what I would attribute sort of significance to would be that section of the media that's more aligned with the opposition and is more inclined to kind of seize upon anything provocative that China would do in order to be able to sort of make that political attack on Modi. So it's by no means a sort of unidimensional thing, as far as I understand it. But again, with the huge caveat that I'm not an expert on India. I have collaborators in India whose takes I very much rely upon, but I'd go to Sushant Singh and other experts like Jabir Jacob to kind of get a much more authoritative take on the explanations for the way Indians view China.
Yes. And of course, we had Sushant on the show last year talking about the current state of India-China relations and the détente on the line of actual control. I want to kind of touch on a couple of the themes that you've brought up in terms of methodology and this question of media narratives that you brought up in the discussion about India. There's been some excellent research in Africa, and I think it plays out in other parts of the world as well, that urban elite views are different than those of rural populations. Urban elites in many developing countries and even in all around the world, even in the global north as well, oftentimes have more access to more sources of information. They tend to consume more social media, more internet, more TV, everything. Rural populations are much more reliant, particularly in poorer countries, on television. And one of the interesting things is that China has been very, very motivated and ambitious in forming partnerships with state broadcasters, so state-to-state media engagement. And what ends up happening is that state broadcasters, say in Kenya and elsewhere, tend to take a very soft view on China. They oftentimes run Chinese media and propaganda, and that is consumed in larger quantities by rural populations that have less access to information. This all comes to a fore in terms of methodology. It's one of the reasons why I don't really like the way that Pew approaches it, because they're using phone and internet, which tends to bias towards urban elites because people in the countryside are harder to reach and don't have as much accessibility to the outside world. And so when we think about these narratives that you talked about in India, and then we talk about the methodology of the different surveys, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but I just want to put some things out there for you about, again, some of these distortions that may come about in terms of how pollsters and survey organizations do their outreach and the power of state media to shape narratives in rural communities. Not sure if you have a view on that.
Absolutely. Look, you're touching again on a super important set of caveats to this type of data and the whole project, really. It's not insurmountable. It's something that it's a work in progress, I think, because this is something which we have actually recorded the mode of the surveys, whether they were taken using online technology or phone or face-to-face. And it's a function that we will introduce in the next version of the Global Public Opinion on China interactive website, where you can actually filter results to see how does the picture change.
And when do we expect to see that, by the way? When should we expect to see that next version?
Thank you for the question. The answer is we should expect to see it once we get some long-term funding for the project. So basically, it's a work in progress.
Always comes down to money, doesn't it?
It does come down to money. And I think we've made, a significant headway in mapping out this, I think, pretty important topic going forward. But there's a lot still to do, and including some pretty low-hanging fruit in terms of further development. And one of those things will be filters on things like the mode by which the survey was conducted. So you'll be able to see globally, if we only include online surveys, how does the picture look different to offline surveys, regionally, and of course at the country level, and various other things as well. All the various different survey sources. You mentioned Pew and their particular approach as well. The various academic barometers. You could filter out, on particular whether the survey is an urban sample or a nationally representative sample, et cetera, et cetera. All of that comes when we're able to further build out the project. So yeah, I don't know if you want to include that or not as a free advertisement for money grubbing, but that's pretty much something that we're working on.
Well, we certainly support the call for money, and we share it as well. So one of the kind of complications that was very interesting for me in the data was some of the findings across the Middle East, particularly that the kind of complications of how China's role in relation to the Uyghur crisis kind of is playing in places like Turkey, and then also the relative lack of impact that the China brokered détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran has had in Iran. So I wonder if you could touch a little bit on these complexities in the Middle East and maybe link them to another issue that I was wondering in relation to the Middle East is how is China affected by large news stories that don't have a direct bearing on China? So, for example, the example I'm thinking of is the crisis in Gaza, where China is very much kind of a bystander, but one that has tried to, that has kind of used it in its own diplomatic work. So how is China in places like the Middle East affected by news that doesn't only have to do with China?
Great questions. I think there's three of them in there. On the big picture of China in the Middle East as the Uyghur crisis has unfolded, listeners, if they're interested, can switch to the sort of regional view, be able to bring up the chart for the Middle East and North Africa. And what you'll see is that really China's image across the Middle East in aggregate has not been affected by its policies of extreme repression against the Uyghurs. So the interpretation there, again, subject to the enormous caveat that I'm not an expert on the individual countries concerned, but the interpretation there would be that, in general, those public statements of support for China's policies in Xinjiang, its counter-terrorism achievements, as they're often described in some of the multilateral statements that China's been able to bring about, have neutralized any effect that the Western media reporting of the Xinjiang crisis and the human rights abuses that have been going on there might have had across the Middle East. Now, as always, there's caveats to that broad brush picture. One of the most interesting is Palestine itself. Of course, the people in the Middle East that are under, the most arguably genocidal pressure already themselves. There's some evidence in this database to suggest that, Palestinians are among the Middle East populations that really do actually care about the Uyghur crisis and actually see that and that it affects China's image among the Palestinians. But in general, in aggregate, it seems like the top-down narrative of counterterrorism achievements outweighs any sense. And it's not just the Western media, of course. Al Jazeera has been very prominent in reporting the Uyghur crisis. So on the Saudi-Iran deal, very interestingly, we found from putting together all the poll results that we could find in Iran, actually China's image in Iran has not been improving as China's taken on this role of mediator in Middle East conflicts. Apparently, at least so far, with some success. The Saudi-Iran deal has broadly appeared to hold since it was struck in 2023, but the recent poll results in Iran have actually been notably negative. So that's another thing, as again, with these sort of quantitative data, which we're talking about a global scale. So there's caveats apply to any given result, and we need to sort of further investigate what might be the reasons behind how China is seen in a given place at a given time. But it appears that the Iranian population isn't particularly impressed with China's mediation efforts, at least so far. And then as for the question of extraneous or exogenous events affecting China's international image, I'm afraid I'm going to have to call once again that this is a work in progress, and this is something that we're going to be investigating into the future. Because, of course, one of the really big examples of that would be the election of Donald Trump. And how does the associated impact on the US's image play into people's views of China, potentially as an alternative? Now, my personal sort of hunch or hypothesis, you might call it, would be that actually people's views of the United States and China are a little more decoupled than we in the West would typically assume them to be. My guess is that a lot of people across a lot of the world would be able to would essentially approach their views of China or their feelings towards China quite separately from how they feel towards the United States. I don't have the hard data to sort of bear that out at this point in time, but that's another sort of direction that we want to take things, and which the truth is out there, so to speak. It just requires more deeper analysis, which we're hopefully going to unfold over the coming months and years.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the more interesting aspects of the incoming Trump administration is the impact that it has on public perceptions of China. Those will probably have some type of linkage going forward, at least for the next 4 years. I'd like to close our discussion with an overview of some of the key takeaways that you pulled from this data set that are published on your site. Number one, you said global public opinion on China is increasingly coming into focus. The number of surveys measuring citizen sentiments towards China has exploded since 2000, you write. Number two, you point out that COVID had a severe impact, particularly in the global south, on China's public approval and public perception. And then finally, you point out that China is not simply making inroads in Africa just by cultivating elites. You mentioned that it is genuinely popular. Could you pick any one of those three as a jumping off point to talk about some of the key takeaways that you think people should consider when they're looking at your data set?
Yeah, sure. And I'll probably jump in on the second point, since we haven't really touched on that yet, and that's the impact of COVID. What's interesting there is that we found, and again, users can sort of visualize this for themselves if they go to the interactive website and look at the different regional charts that are on there. You can actually see quite clearly in North America and Europe, China's image was in decline well before COVID comes along. And then 2020 hits, and China's image continues to decline on very much the same trajectory. So once you sort of shake out all the various differences in the ways that opinion polls are conducted in these places, you find that sort of COVID at most appears to have kind of extended a trend of declining favorability or net approval towards China in the global north. In the global south, it's very much, there is no one story about COVID's impact in the global south. As I mentioned, Middle East and North Africa, China's image has stayed pretty stable through both the Uyghur crisis and then the COVID crisis. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's come off from a high of, I think it was plus 50 or so on average in 2019, down to around about plus, it's in the 30s these days. So the extent to which you could say that you sort of attribute that to an impact from COVID is kind of open to further investigation. You can sort of sustain that narrative. But where there really is a clear narrative of COVID's impact in the global south is Latin America. So if you open up the Latin American chart, you find that China was pretty much as popular as it is today in Africa, across the continent of Latin America, all the way through from 2000, and the polling data coverage in Latin America is very good, all the way from 2000 through to 2019. It's around about the sort of plus 40 mark. And then COVID hits 2020, basically it plunges to around about plus 10 on average. And we're talking about hundreds of data points here. So say what you want about individual survey projects. Once you aggregate them together, the advantage that you have is that you sort of wash out those outlier effects of different survey modes and the like. And so very clear picture emerges that China's image was severely affected, particularly in Latin America. Once again, story different once we switch it over to, say, Southeast Asia, where China's mask diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy seems to have had some positive impact. We see some evidence of a spike in China's image, actually, in 2020, rather than a decline, as seen in Latin America and other places. So really, it's a story of, the global South is not one thing, and certainly global public opinion on China is not one thing, but it's a work in progress that we're working out the ways in which we can actually put these things together and pull out some broader trends that do actually apply, at least regionally, if not globally.
And among the other takeaways, looking at the survey data right now, the global average, and I think the folks in Beijing will be happy to hear this, 29% overall positive, 26% overall negative. So they're still up a few points there, even with all of the difficulties that they've faced, as you pointed out, on COVID and Uyghur issues and other things like that.
Although it's probably worth pointing out that it did actually dip into negative territory for the first time in 22 and 23, I think. So this is an example of that aggregation problem. That's the population-weighted global average, of course. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens going forward. It seems like it's settled sort of above and below the sort of even zero mark. So we'll see going forward whether it trends in one direction or another. But at this point, as you point out, it's a roughly even split.
And again, that's something that we don't really hear very much in places like the US and Europe, where it's decidedly negative. The Global Public Opinion on China data set is available on the Asia Society Policy Institute website. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes so that you can look through all the data yourselves. You can also see some of the analysis that Andrew and the team at ASPI have put together. It's fantastic work, Andrew. Congratulations on it. We're really looking forward to the next version of this that will have even more filters on it. The work that you're doing is incredibly important for us to have a more nuanced understanding of how people feel about China. Again, not just in that North-South divide, but even, within the different countries in the North and the South, because there is a lot of variety and a lot of diversity. Andrew Chubb is a fellow on foreign policy and national security at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and also a senior lecturer at Lancaster University and the team lead on the Global Public Opinion on China project at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Andrew, thank you so much for your time and your insights today, and for all of your support over the years and listening to the show. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cobus, the work that Andrew and his team at the Asia Society Policy Institute are doing on refining public opinion views on China is so important and, again, so desperately needed, because we have so many of these very simplistic surveys that come out, and I put Pew in that one. I'm not a fan of the Pew survey, I'll be honest with you, because I think it is quite reductive. What do you think of China? And people have all of these emotions when it comes to China, and they oftentimes can't differentiate between China the state, a Chinese company, a Chinese media narrative, or whether they had a bad experience using their transient phone, and it all kind of gets wrapped up. And I make the same argument about the US too. These are complex actors, and people have very, very multifaceted emotions on these two big powers that lots of things kind of get mixed in together. And so I don't think that what people are saying about China is that different than what people are saying about the US. That being said, by adding these filters that they want to do to these data sets, it allows you to refine it and to drill down and to try and separate some of these emotions from some facts. What are legitimate criticisms of China, legitimate negative views of China, versus some of the media perceptions and the media narratives that you talked about in the introduction that do tend to flow from places like India, the US, and Europe into global South countries and do have an impact on shaping perceptions. There's no doubt that Western media narratives about China are very effective and getting, in many ways, more effective as newsrooms around Africa, here in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, are being cut back more and more. And so there's a heavier reliance on Agence France Presse, on AP, on Reuters, on Western media to kind of fill a lot of the void that's there. So that's going to be an interesting thing to look at going forward as well. The last point, I think Trump is going to mix all of this up. And just as we saw in the Arab Barometer surveys, that people are going to use China as a kind of in some ways as a vote on the U.S. I don't like the U.S. or I do like the U.S., so therefore I do like China or I don't like China. Those two, I think, are going to be more linked in the Trump era.
Quite possibly. What I'm always looking for in this data, and it's admittedly something that's very difficult to track, but is to which extent is China starting to define reality itself or modern life itself or 21st century life itself? Like, it's difficult to be accurate about the terminology, but to which extent is China just starting to emerge as the general news source for what the world is like? For the world, for the global south particularly, because of course the United States, I think, has played a very strong role in that respect. And it is a role, I think, that's coming under a lot of pressure at the moment. I've seen, just in people I know, and this is extremely anecdotal, but I've seen just like around people I know, more like, and this is admittedly the small sliver of South African society who actually does take an active kind of interest in American issues and who, for example, would regularly read the New York Times. I've seen among them quite an erosion of this kind of role of American media. You know, like people moving to other sources of media or simply, you know, kind of like just starting to talk a lot more about how, oh, that's the US, it's not us. You know, so in that sense, like my sense is that China's still a way away from taking on that role. And what we're finding in the meanwhile is a kind of a fracturing of kind of media sources as a whole. This is a very interesting issue for me. It's like whether over time China starts playing this kind of role of reality giver essentially to the global south.
I mean, are you suggesting that there's going to be a Chinese version of The Rock? And that's going to displace Hollywood in terms of popularity of these superstars?
Oh, like in terms of celebrity culture?
Yeah, in terms of, we talk about the popularity of American media, and American celebrities are still extraordinarily popular. And I don't ever see a day where a Chinese celebrity, for the, you know, with some exceptions, will rival someone, say, the stature of The Rock. And just in part because of language differences, it's tough for them to get over the language barrier.
I think it's beyond language. It's also just media cultures, right? That's just different. But there I actually see a different dynamic, which is, you know, obviously Beyonce remains popular. She will remain popular for a long time. And here I'm talking about Africa specifically. But, you know, increasingly, Africa doesn't need celebrities from elsewhere. It has its own celebrities. So celebrity culture, certainly, you know, it remains a strong part of US, you know, engagement. But I think that is a declining part simply because Africa's own youth culture is rising so rapidly. For me, more specifically, it's about that kind of the way that it provides a kind of a lens to see the world. You know, the way that we, for example, you know, as someone who lives in South Africa, one of the main reasons I know that there is a crisis, you know, like a civil war in Myanmar, for example, is through English language media reporting. So, you know, so whether China is stepping into that kind of role of providing a frame on the world and allowing us to understand the world in particular ways in the same way that the United States has over time. My feeling is the United States' role in that sense is eroding, but slowly. And that China is a kind of a different kettle of fish that won't necessarily step into that role so easily. But it's a very interesting issue for me.
Well, I think that depends on geography as well. So I don't see this happening in Africa, but here in Asia, Chinese celebrities are intensely popular. I'm looking on the homepage right now of VN Express, which is one of the largest newspapers here in Vietnam. And on the front page, Chinese actress Zhao Lusi opens up about battle with depression. That's not a story you would ever see in an African newspaper because who gives a crap about Zhao, right? But here in Southeast Asia, where people are following Chinese dramas, Chinese soap operas, also Chinese internet memes on TikTok, you know, make their way down throughout Southeast Asia, you're going to see that picking up. You're talking about the decline of influence of Hollywood. Nowhere is that more pronounced than here in Asia as well, where K-pop and Korean media has displaced Hollywood in many instances. I mean, you'll go to the Cineplex here, and there'll be one or two Western movies, usually from the United States, and 6 Korean movies. And so I think your fragmentation that you're talking about is happening very differently in different parts of the world. My question is whether or not this helps or hurts Chinese favorability, and what is the driver of it? I'd also like to make the case that I think Chinese efforts to cultivate media elites in the global south have been incredibly effective, especially in Africa, in terms of shaping narratives. You see very little critical coverage in Africa's normally very vibrant independent media about China. And what critical coverage does come up oftentimes is just so poorly informed, you can easily dismiss it. So very little nuanced, thoughtful, critical media coverage of China in the African press. And again, I think China deserves credit for managing its media very effectively, that the junkets and the investments that they make in media partnerships and state-to-state media relationships are very effective. So I think they deserve credit for that, and it's paying dividends.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, one of the areas in kind of African and Global South reporting where I've seen, I think, just an organic kind of really big success for China is in representing modernity and futurity. You know, it's interesting how, for example, like the large drone displays that happened over New Year in Chinese cities, these kind of, I don't know if you've seen them on social media, but they're coordinated kind of like drone pictures in the sky.
They were amazing, incredible.
They drew huge attention. You know, parts of Africa, parts of the African press I've seen, like, and similarly kind of self-driving cars, the very widespread kind of like on the street level deployment of robots, for example, in China, delivery robots and so on. All of those, I think, is they're starting to cohere into this kind of this vision of China as the future in some kind of way, not necessarily always positively, but just as occupying that position in a way that the United States used to occupy, but doesn't really anymore.
And it demonstrates that you can modernize without westernizing.
Yes.
And that is something that the Chinese are living. And by the way, I was just in Japan, and it felt very much the same, that modernization and westernization, I think for a lot of people in the West, are one and the same. But out here, certainly in Asia, I mean, in South Korea, Japan, and China, when you look at the modernization trajectory that they've been on, it does not feel like it's been westernized either. They feel distinctly Asian. And I think that is something also very important. I think that's very appealing to a lot of countries around the world who look at the Western model of society and go, you know what, I like some of it, but I don't like all of it. And China, by leaps and bounds, does present an alternative view on that. So, well, let's put a wrap on that for our first show of 2025. We've got some fantastic guests lined up for you this year, and we're just thrilled to be able to bring you all of this coverage, both on the podcast, but also online. We've got teams, as we mentioned earlier, around the world in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East who put together just fantastic work on data, also a daily newsletter that Cobus works on. Giro's working on the Africa desk. We've got Johnny on the Mideast desk, and then Edwin out here in Indonesia on our Southeast Asia desk, putting together just insights and analysis from the global south that nobody else is doing. This is a space that unfortunately is in desperate need of more analysis, in desperate need of more voices, especially from the impacted countries. And that's the service that we do. We'd love for you to join our community of readers to support the independent journalism that we produce every single day. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, and you can sign up for either monthly or annual subscriptions. Also, we've got a 50% discount for students and teachers. Email me, Eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links. Please remember to use your academic email address when you write to me, and I'll send you the half-off links for subscriptions. So let's leave it there. Cobus, thank you very much. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, South Africa, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South project on Blue Sky and X at China GS Project, or on YouTube at China Global South, and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.